Now, programming from the Illinois Channel, an independent, nonpartisan corporation formed to provide nonpartisan coverage of Illinois state government and other public affairs events taking place across Illinois. For more information on the Illinois Channel, please visit our website at www.illinoischannel.org.
Just ahead, we head to the City Club of Chicago, where House Minority Leader Jim Durkin discusses Governor Rauner's agenda for advancing Illinois and how Democrat and Republican legislators need to work together to solve Illinois' extensive budget problems. Then in about 30 minutes from now, we talk with Dan Long, the Executive Director of the Illinois Commission on Government Forecasting and Accountability, to get his forecast on Illinois' fiscal year 2016 budget. Then in about 40 minutes from now, we talk to State Comptroller Leslie Munger and get her thoughts on how she views the role of the Comptroller, the reforms she would like to implement, the need for the state to update its severely outdated computer systems, and whether she believes the state should merge the office of Comptroller and State Treasurer. Following that, in about 1 hour and 5 minutes from now, we talk to State Representative Ron Sandack about legislation he's filed that would allow municipalities to seek bankruptcy protection under Chapter 9 of the U.S. Bankruptcy Code. Then in about 1 hour and 15 minutes from now, we talk to State Senator Darin Lahood, who in light of U.S. Representative Aaron Schock's recent resignation, discusses his interest in running for the seat. And finally, in about 1 hour and 20 minutes from now, we attend a hearing of the House Education Funding Task Force and hear from representatives of the task force and the representative of Northern Illinois University discuss the effects of the Education Funding Reform Bill, SB 1. That's all just ahead, after a brief word from one of our advisory council members.
Hi, I'm Matt Hart, Executive Director of the Illinois Trucking Association. For over 80 years, we've represented the interests of those who work in the Illinois trucking industry. We work with members of the legislature to pass laws to help make the roads safer, to help keep Illinois trucking competitive, and to help provide ongoing educational opportunities for those in our industry. The technology of trucking is forever changing. So too are the laws regulating the trucking industry. That's why the Illinois Trucking Association is proud to support the work of the Illinois Channel, which keeps citizens around Illinois connected to what's happening in state government and what changes are being discussed that will impact their families, their communities, their future. And the Illinois Channel gives those of us in industry an opportunity to share our thoughts on public policy with our fellow citizens across Illinois. I'm Matt Hart, Executive Director of the Illinois Trucking Association. I'm also proud to serve on the Illinois Channel's Advisory Council on Transportation. The Illinois Channel, it works for all of us.
Next from Chicago, we head to the City Club of Chicago, where House Minority Leader Jim Durkin discusses Governor Rauner's agenda for advancing Illinois and how Democrat and Republican legislators need to work together to solve Illinois' extensive budget problems. This runs about 30 minutes.
But in any event, I truly want to thank you for inviting me back. It is an honor. It is an honor to be here, but it also is an honor to serve in the legislature and to have the confidence of my members in the House Republican Caucus from as far south as Murfreesboro, all the way up to Freeport, as far east as far west as the Quad Cities and Metro East, and all the way in the border of Indiana and Danville. It's a great experience. I work with amazing people. Sometimes we are not held in the highest regard, but I will tell you that we work hard. People do their best in Springfield under very challenging circumstances. But it's just this past year and a half has been like with all of us, except maybe Speaker Madigan, but it's been a learning experience. And and I certainly have learned a lot over the past 2 years. Now, a year and a half ago when I came here, many of you were expressing and congratulating me on this new role, but I think most of you today are coming in and they're extending your condolences. That's a little early, guys, premature. But Governor Egger just recently said within the last 2 weeks that both Chris Radonio, our Senate Republican leader, and myself have the toughest jobs in Springfield. But I can tell you with complete honesty that I am more excited today than I was when I accepted this position a year and a half ago. And that's because the people of Illinois issued a very strong mandate when they had the wisdom to elect a Republican governor, Bruce Rauner. Am I going to do this the rest of the lunch? Come on, guys. Somebody wrote in here applause after that. I mean, is there a sign of it? I don't think so. But we know these moments, guys. I mean, come on. We've been here before. Paul, come on. Do you want to raise like a glass? All right, but the first time in a long time the Republicans do have a seat at the table, and that seat is much bigger. Now, we do have naysayers that have already started their work, and that's part of the business that we're involved in, whether it's in Washington or Springfield. But I think all of us who are down in Springfield, particularly Republicans, and I think and Democrats also understand this as well, because we do have a divided government, a good divided government. But the sun has clearly broken through the clouds that hang over the Capitol, and there is truly a feeling of optimism in Springfield, which we have not seen in a long time. The status quo has just not been working, folks, and I think all of us know that. Let me just give you one example. Shortly after the election, and this is right out of the box, after the election of Governor Rauner, and because of the election of Governor Rauner, Caterpillar, our amazing worldwide manufacturer of heavy equipment material, of engines and equipment, announced that it would remain in Illinois. It would remain in Illinois and in Peoria, despite, I will say this, I believe, a long-standing anti-business climate. And folks, Caterpillar does not make these decisions based on emotion. CEO Doug Oberhelman personally told me that he had been lobbied heavily, significantly, by Governor Rick Perry of Texas, Governor Rick Scott of Florida, to relocate in their states with substantial incentives, taxpayer money from those states. We welcome you. We want you, Caterpillar. But Caterpillar sees better days ahead in Illinois because of Governor Rauner and the leadership that he will bring to the office of governor. And best of all for Caterpillar, they are staying here in Illinois, making $1 billion investment to redo their whole World Corporate Center in Peoria without asking for one penny of state taxpayer incentives. So right there, folks, right, like I said, right out of the box, something as good has happened. The news from Caterpillar is very good for all of us. But what would have happened if we'd have lost Caterpillar? It would have meant the loss of over 3,000 jobs in the Peoria area alone. And to the state of Illinois, now Caterpillar is a $55 billion global construction equipment maker. You guys do the math. If they would have left, what Fortune 500 companies in Illinois would be next? And the one after that. But just remember, a lot of people talk about corporate Illinois. They say some negative things about them, but the fact is they put people to work. They put a lot of people to work in this state. We need to help them. We need to embrace them. And I think our business community should be receiving a hero's welcome every day in this state, as opposed to having targets on their back that they have for the past 12 years. Oh, that's better. All right. Over the past few months, we've had the opportunity to work and to get to know Bruce Rauner a little bit better. Paul, I saw that. What we know from his past life is that he was a tremendously successful, highly successful businessman. But what we are experiencing right now and what we get to know about Bruce Rauner is that he is a very committed chief executive and also a very strong leader. Governor Rauner is doing what he campaigned on. No one should be surprised with his agenda. He is doing exactly what he was saying he was going to do. We heard it all through the campaign. He understands that it's going to take a bipartisan effort to advance and to realize his, I would say, very aggressive and bold agenda, and also to reach those goals. And I tell you what, for those of you who were there for the inauguration of Governor Rauner, he could not have been more loud and clear about problems in Springfield will require a bipartisan fix, and they will. We've heard that rhetoric before. We got to work bipartisan. We got to work bipartisan. But the fact is, the dynamics of Springfield are so much different right now because we do have this divided government. We have checks and balances. We have, obviously, majorities both in the House and Senate, but the dynamics with having Governor Rauner on the second floor of the Capitol has changed everything in that building, and everyone knows that when you walk down there. You can feel it in the air when you walk into that building, and it's good. But what really impresses me most about the governor right now is his desire to get to know members of the General Assembly on a very personal basis, and that's from both sides of the aisle. He is constantly meeting with lawmakers, breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and folks, that's unprecedented. And I will also say I've had a good relationship with many governors in the past, but he is without a doubt the most accessible governor that I have worked with in my legislative career. Senate Leader Chris Radonio and I meet with him individually every week, at least once a week. We have a call once a week. We're going to have one this afternoon. I'm not going to give in the dial-in number for you guys because those are still secret. But he is really, truly doing a great job putting in the time and effort to build relationships, to build bridges, to help bring this divide that we've had down there for so many years, because he understands it, and the problems they're not insurmountable, folks, but we can get it done. It's going to take time. Now, last month, the governor presented his budget address, and yes, it was on time. Yeah. For the first time in many years, the legislature will be asked to support a budget that is premised on a basic notion. The same notion most of us exercise in our own homes. Most of us, I'll say most of us. That is, spend no more than what you bring in, and not a penny more. Governor Rauner has committed to spending $32 billion in fiscal year 16, which is the estimate of revenues we anticipate to take into the state treasury during that time period. It will be up to the legislature, working together in a bipartisan manner, to determine how to spend these dollars. Not unexpectedly, some are loudly complaining about proposed cuts and reforms which he gave in his budget address. Again, there should be no surprise with anything he has said. None of this is new. Our appropriation committees will go through their orderly course of business to craft a budget, but it is my hope that the majority party will cooperate with us and the Governor Rauner to craft a final budget where spending matches our revenues, plain and simple. I can tell you that Governor Rauner is fair, and while he's doing the right thing by insisting we limit our spending to $32 billion, the amount of revenue that we expect to come in next year, he is flexible in how we get there. And I've said that time and time again. I got all the calls of individuals said, you can't do this, you can't do that. But the fact is, he's very flexible. He's open to how we make these cuts. We will be sensitive to the people that are in most need. But the fact is, we cannot do what we've done in the past. And that means we have to live within our means. Years and years of overspending have left us with steep and deep structural deficits, massively underfunded pension systems, and billions of dollars in unpaid bills. Many will ask, and many have asked, well, why don't you just raise taxes? Well, let me tell you why that's a bad idea. 4 years ago, the Illinois Democrats, in a lame duck session, which we should just get rid of, period, because there's been nothing that's good ever come out of a lame duck session. The last 2 years, have proposed constitutional amendments to limit and eliminate lame duck sessions in Springfield. Maybe we'll get a hearing from the Rules Committee. So, Paul, if you can perhaps get some influence with the people over in the Rules Committee, I could use your help. But I think it's important that we have a full discussion on that, about what it's done to the state of Illinois. If it's fair to the taxpayers and the people who rely upon Illinois, it just doesn't seem like it's a good idea. I've seen it, and the fact is, there was a time back in the mid-'90s when I started, and yes, there were things that happened in the lame duck session. You look back, and I'm like, that was not a good idea. But, someday maybe Republicans will get the majority back. But the fact is, lame duck sessions are no good. They're no good in Washington. They're no good in Springfield. But 4 years ago, I said that the income tax was ramrodded, and I will say ramrodded, through the legislature, the single largest tax increase on families and employers in state's history. And it was sold to the public on the House floor as a way to pay down the backlog of unpaid bills, reduce unemployment, and a way to solve our structural deficits. Well, we all know how it turned out, folks. In January 2015, the temporary tax expired. Despite $31 additional billion coming in over that period with those tax increases, nothing really changed. Our problems still remain the same. So, ladies and gentlemen, what I'm telling you is that the tax increase did not work. However, we can put Illinois back on path by balancing budgets, true budgets that are balanced, revenues match spending, bringing stability, further stability, and help to our very, very struggling and suffering pension systems, continuing the reforms in our Medicaid systems that Patty Bellock spent her career on, and improving our job climates with the pro-growth agenda, the things that the governor's been talking about. But it won't be easy, but we have to be able to, for the first time in a long time, prove to the people in the state of Illinois that we are going to spend their money in a responsible manner. They need to they need to be ensured that their investment every April is going to be a good investment. The way I see it, we have two choices. Either we begin by adopting the balanced budgets I just talked about that force us to make difficult but responsible decisions, ones that improve the overall health of our state, or we can continue down the path of passing unbalanced budgets that make unrealistic promises. And folks, to me, that would be unconscionable. I think somebody heard that word last week, but I want to use that as well. Making those promises in unbalanced budgets is irresponsible. To borrow from a phrase that what's been used in elections over and over again, we can't kick the can down the road. But friends, as I speak to you today, March 16th, 2015, there is simply no can left to kick. Illinois demands honesty in budgeting and spending. I implore the majority party to work in good faith with the governor, Leader Radonio, and myself to pass a budget that lives within our means. You getting the theme here, folks? I think so. We can start off on a good foot by bringing balance to the unbalanced FY15 budget that we're currently operating under, that Governor Rauner inherited on January 12, 2015. We are rapidly approaching the last quarter of FY15. We have a $1.6 billion shortfall. We are very close to the date when our child care program will run out of money. That cannot happen. Court reporters won't get paid. If they don't get paid, lawyers, I guess they won't show up to work. And I guess then we will have to rely upon the honor system in the courtrooms, guys, to find out what transpired in that court hearing or that trial. Sounds like a great idea, doesn't it? Also, if we do not fix this problem very soon, prison guards, the Illinois Department of Correction, will not get paid. And again, if they don't get paid, will they show up? Well, who knows? But if they don't, again, I guess we'll have to rely upon the honor system of the inmates within the Illinois Department of Corrections. I don't think that's a good idea either. But we need to get it done, I think, very soon, possibly this week, no later than next week, to avoid. Those are just a few examples of the concerns that have been brought out, have been much publicized over the past month. But we also need to further avoid any further downgrade of our very fragile credit rating. I believe that we're very close to a resolution on FY15, as I said earlier, and we could put that $1.6 billion issue to bed. I'm not looking to point fingers in the past. We need to move forward and look, start looking more forward to how we're going to get this stuff done. But we have to get this done very soon, folks, this month. It's very clear that, when people talk about how much they have distrust in Washington and Springfield, it's because the parties just don't get along, and they haven't for such a long time. The voters, when they voted for Governor Rauner, they voted for him to bring change to Illinois, and that means that Republicans and Democrats, whether they like each other or not, are going to have to fix the problems. We have to put the politics aside for a little bit, folks. There's too much at stake. There's way too much at stake I just told you just the examples that we're living with. But I will say that this past year, Leader Radonio and I worked closely with President Cullerton and also Speaker Madigan on some very important issues. Statewide public pension reform, pension bills for the city of Chicago, a road capital program, just to name a few. And one thing I said about a year and a half ago is that I made sure that people know this, and I'm going to work with the Speaker, and that my caucus is not going to be the caucus of no. We're going to continue to work with, whether it's Cook County government to get a good pension bill to help them with their criminal justice system, about the problems they have in their jail. Glad to work with you, President Preckwinkle. We'll do it. We'll work in good faith. Glad to do it, and it's responsible. That's what we're going to do. So, folks, I will just say that, somebody said, Jim, you're going to tell some Irish jokes, and I'm like, yeah, let's see. I think somebody mentioned something about the Brookfield Zoo early. I've heard that joke before, but I don't think we're going to go there. Somebody talked to me about something about Irish chili. I don't think we're going to go there either. But I just want to wish all of you a very happy St. Patrick's Day. And I will just say this. For those of you who share in my enthusiasm for change in Springfield, I raise this glass and have one word to say to you. Sláinte. Now, I know it's sláinte because I think a lot of you have probably butchered it over the weekend. It's S-L-A-I-N-T-E, and people, slante, that kind of stuff. But I watched The Source last night. It was Waking of Ned Devine, and at the end they used sláinte. So I feel very confident by saying sláinte for those, as I said, who share in my enthusiasm for change in Springfield. But for those of you who believe otherwise, I have two words to say to you. Pogue Mahone. And if you don't know what that means, look it up in the dictionary. Anyway, all right, there's your humor, guys. But again, thank you so much for this opportunity. let me just say this. It's an honor always to serve in the legislature. It's historic. And I've told my colleagues, whenever you get sworn into the House of Representatives or the State Senate or a constitutional officer, it's historic. But the fact is, being sworn in right now is historic during historic times. And we need to make our mark on history and move this state back into the direction, the same state that we knew and loved when we grew up, when we had opportunities, educational opportunities, and employment opportunities that everybody in this room knows about. We need to make sure that this next generation is going to have that same type of opportunity. So it's responsible, it's the right thing for doing, and that's really a question. We have to do it. So thank you so much, and thank you for not asking any questions. I really appreciate that, folks. Thanks a lot, Paul. You know, Paul, you said earlier that it's really interesting that Republicans are now getting, great crowds. I thought you were talking about people really wanted to come see me. He said, no, it's because Bruce Rauner got elected. So thanks for that inspiring confidence that you leveled with me earlier in the day. So thanks, Paul.
Great job. How about a round of applause? If you have a question, whether it's in English or Gaelic, raise your hand up. Thanks, Mush. Showing you bipartisans, you're right off the bat.
First one, what's the definition of Pogue Mahone? Let's see, that would be kiss.
Easy. You got your ride here, for God's sake. Representative Ken Duncan, our state needs more revenue. Will you put Republican votes on new revenue? Specifically, what do you propose? No reason to start off with an easy one.
Well, Representative Duncan, I think we had a similar question about a year and a half ago, but the point of the matter is that the governor has stated that he does not intend to raise taxes in FY16, that we are going to live within the $32.1 billion revenue projection that we've got back from the governor's office of management and budget. And quite frankly, I've not heard of any discussion about any new revenues being sought from the administration. I don't think anybody in my caucus is asking for new revenues, but Representative Duncan, I think, as I said earlier, 32.1, which goes back to about 3.5, 4 years ago. That's the number that we lived within back at that time. Spending increased dramatically. It's going to be a difficult year, and but the fact is, Republicans will not be supporting any revenue in this next General Assembly, and that includes the governor and also the House and Senate Republicans.
Okay. We have a couple of other questions, some good ones, but the moderator, unassuming as he is, that's a very good answer, or at least your truthful answer. Let me put it another way. Will your House Republicans be able to vote yes on tough budget cutting votes?
We're going to have that fairly soon with FY16. And again, I'm not going to go point fingers of how we got there, but the House Republicans will be supporting cuts to balance out the unbalanced FY15 budget. As I said earlier, we have a 32.1 revenue number in which we are going to work off this year. The governor's made it quite clear that how we get to that 32.1 is up to the four appropriation caucuses, open for negotiation, but we are going to be putting votes on cuts. Make no mistake about that. Now the question is whether the House Democrats, Senate Democrats are going to join us with those cuts to meet that number. I'm hearing all kinds of anecdotal things about that. I think it's premature, but the fact is there will be tough budget cuts, and we are going to work on that. That is the reason why the House Republicans and I think the Senate Republicans have not supported these budgets over the many years, because we thought the spending was too high, or is that they were unbalanced. They were not good. They were, I think, unfair. They were premised on, I think, false expectations, and this past year was one of them. So we'll be ready to vote on tough budget cuts very soon to balance out the unbalanced FY15 budget, which we just got to get done, guys, and also FY16. It could be a long year, folks. I'm not going to, make no mistakes about it. We could be down there for a while. I'm not telling you guys to extend your leases on your apartments through the summer, but you might want to see if you have an option available. But no, we will. We will.
Okay, we have a lot of good questions, and let's try and limit these extended answers.
No, I learned that trick from Jim Egger long ago. Yep.
That's right. We don't want to go back there. Yes, I was part of that. All right. Neil Nason. Thanks for phonetically spelling it. It's a very good question. He's from Immunize Chicago. What is holding us back from saving money by combining our general elections and our municipal elections? Good question. Probably a lot of municipal candidates, but that's just my
No, it's real simple. It's called control of the Rules Committee in the House and the Senate. So I would have no problems combining these elections, but and I'm not. This is not about punting, but this is about the House Democrats and the Senate Democrats who run the chambers, who allow bills to move if they see it's in their best interest. So, but it's really a question of just the control of the chambers. That's it.
Okay, very good question coming up. Quick answer. Abby Pfeiffer, McCormick Foundation. Do you support legislation that requires a civics course to graduate?
Wow. I thought we had that, isn't that? Sure. Unfunded mandate, I'm not sure, just as long as there's no money attached to it. But I don't know if there's a bill pending out there. It sounds fine. We want our students to know a little bit about government when they leave. That's all good. But look, I'll support something like that if it's revenue neutral on our local governments and our local schools. Because I tell you what, our schools are going to have some problems over the next few years. There's going to be budget cuts. But one of the things that the governor has made perfectly clear that he's going to do everything he can to stop unfunded mandates upon our schools and also our local governments. Now, I think this is fine. It could be an optional. I haven't gotten there. I'll be quite frank with you. But the fact is, if there's a dollar amount that's attached to it that's going to be placed in our schools, I don't think it's the right thing to do at the time.
Oh, well, the moderator disagrees. They should be a civics course. No cut. No. Everything else I agree, but that one is Mark Weiermiller, sitting on the far right of the order, and by the way, properly sitting indeed. Question on pensions. Do you see Illinois moving towards IRAs or 401ks for a phase out of the current system?
Wow. Well, I'm surprised we got that one. It's late. All right, guys. The pensions are like we've all said. We want to see what the Supreme Court does. They heard the arguments last week. A lot of people may have watched it. There's two questions before the Supreme Court. If they could do one of two things. The request that was made from the state of Illinois is to kick it back down to the circuit court to have an evidentiary hearing on whether or not the police power authority should be an act to override the impairment clause of the Illinois Constitution. The circuit court, as you know, stated they never got to a hearing because they said that the impairment clause is absolute. So the question of moving forward towards IRAs and 401ks for a phase out of current systems, it is one thing that the governor is talking about. Getting it through the legislature will not be easy. I want to see exactly what the savings will be at the end of the day if we do something like this for current employees and retirees, because I do believe we still have obligations to people who are in the defined benefit program to ensure that their pensions will be met. I have to study, and I'm not punting, guys, but the fact is I need to see what the long-term and actuarial effects upon the system will be if there's a 401k system that's going to be for Tier 3 employees, new employees that come into the system. Because these systems are based on people, paying them, people who are joining the system, paying into the, whether it's TRS, CSRS, and the other ones. So I don't have an answer on that. But I think, again, at the end of the day, it is a benefit that will continue, some type of pension benefit for employees in some form. But right now, I don't want to, I'll be quite honest with you. What we did a year and a half ago with the pension systems was it was very difficult to get there. Do I want to revisit it? No. The Supreme Court may make us revisit it. But the governor has a very bold, and I think very, he feels very strong that there should be some type of 401k option that's going to be placed for these new employees. But again, the cost is what's the cost and how it's going to affect the people who are currently in the system, people who are going to be in the system.
Okay, two last questions, a very quick one here. Mike Lieber from Ice Miller. I know where you're sitting, I know. Will you commit to, oh Jesus. I just read them. Will you commit to killing the wasteful, unnecessary Ileana Expressway?
Didn't I used to work together at the same firm? Okay. This thing's not even on the radar. I'll just say that. I don't think the governor is particularly, is looking to do anything with Ileana right now. Look, I've heard some people have made the argument because of the truck traffic. You've got the intermodal in Will County that there needs to be something that opens up, but this is kind of a loaded question, but I will just say that it's not on the radar. So, okay.
Last question. I'm sure you're happy about it, Jim. Here we are. Harvind Singh from, did I say that right? Singh Associates, kind of the same genre. Can you speak on infrastructure, transportation budget? Is the gas tax still off the table?
Well, I think what you have to realize that under the current condition that we have in the state of Illinois, that nothing's off the table, everything's on the table. Infrastructure is something that this governor feels very strong about. He realized you need to make an investment into roads, bridges, railways, all the things that go along with it. Good jobs are provided by that. I'm not sure if we're there with a capital program, but again, we have to find a revenue source to be able to pay this, and we also need to maintain, to a certain extent, what we have within our road fund. So, but I'm not going to mislead you. Everything's on the table, folks, because we have some difficult decisions to make on balancing out FY15. There will be cuts that are in FY15, and what's left in FY16, and how we're able to replenish any funds that could be subject to sweeps within the next 2 weeks is a matter for the legislature to consider. There are working groups right now that are discussing all types of alternatives to gas tax and how we can keep and have a more reasonable way to ensure that the road fund is going to stay healthy. And we'll get a report back from them in the next month and a half. But I don't have a great answer for you. I'm sorry. But just assume that everything's on the table.
How about a round of applause for our...
Next, from Springfield, we talk with Dan Long, the Executive Director of the Illinois Commission on Government Forecasting and Accountability, to get his forecast on Illinois' fiscal year 2016 budget. This runs about 12 minutes.
All right, Dan Long, thank you so much for joining us here on the Illinois Channel from the Commission on Government Forecasting and Accountability, also known as COGFA. So the recent forecast for fiscal year 16 was recently presented to the Commission. Can you go ahead and just give us a brief overview of the major highlights that was founded in that forecast?
Sure. First, we went over some economic data, mainly focusing on employment. That's what drives an economy. And over the years, since the Great Recession, Illinois has trailed, starting in about fiscal year 9 or 10, trailed both the nation and the Midwest in terms of jobs. Recently, the United States has fulfilled or added all the jobs that were lost during the Great Recession. Not only added, it's even increased above what was lost. Illinois still hasn't reached that point. And we never regained the jobs that we lost during the last recession before the latest recession started. So that's always been an issue, and as a result, that's has an impact on revenue. We look at the number of people employed mainly, as opposed to unemployed. There's more people working. The second issue with regard to employment that was brought about was that a lot of the jobs that have been lost in Illinois are in manufacturing, and those jobs that are being replaced are in generally lower paying jobs, such as in the medical field or in the retail sector, service sector. So that was kind of an issue with the economy, and as a result of that, that can have an impact on revenues. When we got to revenues, we wanted to update the fiscal 15 revenues first. The House in the last several years has adopted a joint resolution or a joint resolution adopting the revenue estimates of the Commission. We updated that revenues for fiscal year 15, and they're about $1.3 billion less than what was adopted at the beginning of the fiscal year. So that puts pressure on the budget. There were several areas. One, the corporate income tax is down. The second area had to do with federal sources. In order to get Medicaid reimbursement, you have to spend money, and then you get reimbursed 50% from the feds, and that money simply hasn't been available to pay down a lot of those bills. And then the third area is when they passed the budget for fiscal 15, the legislature included borrowing $650 million from other state funds that would have to be paid back to those funds over an 18-month period. And thus far, the governor, current governor, has indicated he's not going to utilize that money. Obviously, it's been widely reported there's negotiations going on in terms of maybe utilizing some money from those other funds, but at this juncture, we've taken that money out of the forecast. So that establishes a base then, are going into fiscal 16. And in fiscal 16, the revenues are going to be down closer to around $2 billion. The big portion of that's from the big three: income tax, both corporate and personal, and sales taxes, although they're reported to be doing a little better. But we're going to be down about $2 billion in addition to the $1.3 billion for this year. So it's a significant amount of money, and I think that's why the budget was introduced. Included a lot of reductions in programmatic spending, simply because there's going to be far fewer revenues to support those programs.
Okay, and the income tax rate went down in January, and you're saying that for fiscal year 16, we're going to be down $2 billion. Mm-hmm. The income tax rate is the major factor of that?
That's a major factor, yes, because for fiscal 15, since it didn't take effect till January of this year, you lost only 6 months of revenue at the higher levels, which had the personal income tax at 5%, which is dropping to 3.75, and corporate at 7%, which would be dropping down to about 5.25. So that's a major loss in revenue, because your largest sources are the corporate and the personal income tax in particular, and then you've got sales tax, and then you've got corporate tax. So by reducing those percentages in fiscal 16, it'll be the first full year of that revenue loss, and even though you're going to get some increases in some other lines, overall we believe that revenues will be down over $2 billion, around $2 billion, and it could be higher depending on, again, federal sources. It's very hard to predict federal sources because we don't know exactly what the reimbursable spending is going to be, but we believe it'll be at least $2 billion, and combined with the decrease in 15, you're well over $3 billion loss in revenues.
Okay. During the presentation to the Commission, you mentioned something about Illinois being almost like two economies. Can you speak on that a little bit?
Oh, sure. Each year, one of the statutory duties of the Commission is to prepare a report on the economy of Illinois, which was done by Moody'sEconomy.com, our Moody's organization, which we published. And they looked at it, and there's two areas, like Chicago and Lake County, seem to be growing. Chicago in particular is adding a lot of high-tech jobs around the merchandise mart in that area. But the rest of the state is not. You've not recovered the jobs. You're not seeing the expansion of businesses either expanding or locating in the state. So that's where we talked about, well, there's almost two economies in Illinois. One's up north, but you've only got like Chicago and Lake County, but even the collar counties, are not doing, most of them are not doing as well either. So that's what was meant by that, the fact that there's almost two economies in the state.
Mm-hmm. And it was also mentioned that there has been a little bit of a growth rate. I don't know, I think it was for the past year, it was like 2.5%.
Well, we talked about the overall economy and the GDP growth, and the economy's kind of been stuck at 2% growth, even though for some quarter to quarter there's been some variances. It was high as like 4.8 one quarter, and the next quarter you're down, 2%. So we're kind of stuck in this mode of 2%, which limits or holds back the number of jobs that are available.
And what's normal?
Well, you'd like to have 3.5 to 4%. Then you've got more robust growth. You've definitely seen business expansion and hiring, substantially more hiring. There'd be a lot more jobs available to individuals. As you know, a lot of folks coming out of college these days are having a hard time finding a job. And it's simply because when you're growing at 2%, the economy's simply not growing fast enough, generating enough new jobs to absorb those individuals coming into the job market. And that's what we're seeing, certainly on a national level. Even though we've recovered all those jobs that we lost during the Great Recession, but it took 5 years, so it's been the slowest recovery since at least World War II. Been a very slow recovery. And Illinois, of course, has trailed the country in job growth, so it's even you even feel it more in this state than even some of our surrounding states.
Why do you think that is? I mean, we keep hearing from lawmakers, Illinois is in a great location. We have so many, resources available to us. What's the problem? Governor Rauner wants to make Illinois compassionate and competitive. Why are we trailing other states?
Well, a lot of it probably has to do with our fiscal situation. Companies don't like uncertainty. And so, the taxes were at one level, they went up to another level, now they're supposed to go down, but then they may go back up. We have a $100 billion unfunded pension liability. And how do you solve that? You don't have solved it by increasing taxes. So I think many would argue it's simply a lot of it has to do with our fiscal issues. But you're right, in terms of, we do have great transportation systems, access to capital. We have a lot of positives, but there's also some negatives that have held the state back. And that's outlined in our report that we did on the economy, and it's online. I'd encourage people to go on and take a look at that, because it not only looks at the short term, but looks at the long term aspects for Illinois as well. Okay.
And then in the presentation, I remember something was mentioned about a housing crisis. Something about.
I don't know if it's a crisis. Illinois did get hit harder than some of the other states in terms of foreclosures, and we're working our way through that. And what you're seeing is that as a result of, one, it's difficult to get loans these days, and so what you're seeing is that you're seeing the increase in multi-family housing, like apartments and those types of things, but not in single-family housing. And the permits, you look at permits because that's a precursor to new home construction, and those are at a very low level in Illinois. We have worked our way through, and we're still working our way through, but we have worked our way through a lot of the foreclosure activity that took place, not just in Illinois, but a lot of states. But we're still kind of working our way through that. And so I think that's what they're talking about in terms of, I wouldn't call it a crisis anymore, but certainly we're working our way out of it, and it's not nearly what it was a few years ago.
Okay. So overall, if you had to I don't know if there's a way to sum up Illinois' economy, there's a growth rate, but it's very slow, correct? Mm-hmm. Okay. Is there anything else you'd like to add?
No, I think that, we're trying to work our way out of it, and I think these fiscal issues have a big part of it, or will be a big part of it. Hopefully the legislature and the governor will be able to work out some kind of solutions to these problems, and I think they will. We have a lot of smart people here in the legislature and in the governor's office, and I think they'll work their way through that and get Illinois' fiscal situation stabilized, and I think that'll do a lot to help with the economic growth in the long term.
Okay, thank you so much, Dan from COGFA, for joining us here on the Illinois Channel.
Well, thank you very much, Shirley.
Next from Springfield, we talk to State Comptroller Leslie Munger and get her thoughts on how she views the role of the Comptroller, the reforms she would like to implement, the need for the state to update its severely outdated computer systems, and whether she believes the state should merge the office of Comptroller and State Treasurer. This runs about 25 minutes.
Comptroller Leslie Munger, thanks for joining us on the Illinois Channel.
Happy to be here.
As I think anyone who watches Illinois politics realizes, you were appointed to fulfill the term of Judy Barja-Pinka after her unexpected death just after she was reelected to the post. And so a lot of people really don't necessarily know a whole lot about you since you didn't run for the office. So let's start there. Who is, if someone says, who is Leslie Munger, what do you say?
I'm a lifelong Illinoisan, born and raised in Joliet. Went to school here in Illinois, University of Illinois grad, proud Illini. Went to Northwestern to get my master's in business at the Kellogg School of Management. Worked in Illinois, worked at McKinsey & Company, Procter & Gamble, actually that was in Ohio briefly, and back to Illinois where I worked at Helene Curtis. I'm a businesswoman. I have 25 years of private sector business experience. I've led brands that most people have probably used in their own homes: Suave shampoo, Finesse conditioner, Degree antiperspirant. I eventually was responsible for the $800 million U.S. hair care business at Helene Curtis. When I stopped working to raise my children, I probably should maybe back up and say I'm a wife. I'm married to John, my husband, for almost 27 years. And we have 2 sons, Tom and Andy. Tom is 24, living in Texas right now. He's a U of I engineer. Our son Andy is about to graduate from U of I in accounting and finance in May. When I stopped working to stay home and raise our kids, I became a volunteer in our community, and any busy person knows that you have a little time on your hands. Somebody will say, well, will you help with this? And, oh yeah, I could help with that. And then someone will say, well, would you get involved and be on this? Oh, sure, I could help with that. And pretty soon before I knew it, I was involved in everything in my community. And one of the things that I'm most proud of my volunteerism with is a group called the Riverside Foundation. It's a home for developmentally disabled adults in Lincolnshire. I've been an active volunteer with the Women's Board for 15 years. I've sat on the board of directors for the foundation. It was actually there I saw firsthand how difficult it is when the state can't pay its bills. And we on Riverside Board were taking out loans because the state was a year behind and $1 million in arrears paying us at the time. And it was one of the things I noticed what a difference the Comptroller can make, because when Judy was elected Comptroller and started prioritizing payments for not-for-profits, it was there that I saw, wow, you know, this is how someone can make a difference in the state. That was really my first personal connection with the Comptroller's office. So, I'm a businesswoman, I'm a volunteer in my community, I'm a wife, I'm a mother. I love my state. My family is here, except for my son who's in Texas now. And we're hoping we'll get him back to Illinois.
So you obviously, those years in business, I think you had actually worked, what was it, Helene Curtis with Ron Gidwitz?
Yes.
As you were mentioning the shampoo products and all?
Yes.
How does that business background mesh with government? Now, obviously, you're just fairly new to government, and also, how is the culture different, would you say, as far as how you operate in the business realm and you operate in the government realm?
Well, it's interesting. The business realm, I think the state could use a little bit more of the business, at least focus, from the standpoint of looking to do things more efficiently, more affordably, looking to improve, in the case of brands, improve what you deliver to your consumers. In the case of government, improve services, so better services at the same cost, or same services at a lower cost would be things that a business approach would bring to state government. The culture, I think the most surprising thing to me as someone who's worked in business and also in a volunteer situation, you get a good idea, you get a group of people together, you say, let's get this done, you find out who you need to buy in, you all agree, you go do it. And so what I've learned in my very short time here in state government is you get a good idea, you talk to people, they say that's a great idea. Now first you got to get some legislation passed through the legislature. That'll take a few months. And we hope we can get it out of committee, and then you have to figure out how it's going to get funded, and then hopefully in X amount of very long time you will be able to get going on it. So the timeline to get something done in government is just so tremendously different than anything you would ever see in business. So.
You find yourself chewing on pencils out of frustration?
I just keep talking to a lot of people, honestly. I have been out, I have a few things that I'd like to get done in my time here as Comptroller, and I have been out talking to a lot of people just saying, this is why this is right to do, and try to build a lot of enthusiasm about it, and also to answer questions on the front end of some of these things, because I think the more people understand what I'm trying to accomplish here and why it's a good thing for the state, I think more people will be able to say, oh, that makes a lot of sense, and we'll get it moving more quickly.
What are you trying to, what are some of those good ideas? What are some things you're trying to accomplish?
Well, let me just back up a minute and say, so when I look at what we need to do in our government, bringing my business perspective to bear here, I thought I'd like to see us look for things that we can do to make our government more transparent, so that we can follow the money, because if you can follow the money, you can change how, and you know where you're spending it, you can change how you're spending it. You probably know that we are very, very badly in debt in our state. As of this morning, we have $8 billion in what we call a bill backlog. That's the nice term for we've spent $8 billion more than we can pay for right now. And so we have all these bills sitting, we have them in the Comptroller's office or sitting in the agencies waiting to come in, but basically it's we've overspent our state credit card by $8 billion. We have to find ways to be more efficient, and we have to find ways to make our government more affordable so we can pay these bills. And let me just go back to the point that I made earlier, that we are crowding out our ability to pay for critical services. People who depend on state government, like people at Riverside Foundation, who I worked with, these are people that we cannot fund anymore or have difficulty paying on time. We get phone calls in our office constantly from agencies and not-for-profits who we are behind paying them, and they're hand to mouth for payments. So that's one of the reasons why it's important to get our state budget under control. So transparency for where we spend our money, I think, is one of the most important things we can do. Second, looking for structural changes that we can do that will help our government operate less expensively, more efficiently going forward every single day. And third, looking for ways that we can just drive productivity and efficiency through everything we do. Looking, I guess, for ways to spend each dollar more productively. So kind of three general buckets. So the first thing I'd like to see us do is to implement a new statewide accounting system. If you've heard anything about what goes on,
I want to underscore that, because statewide accounting system, right? Is that what you said?
Statewide accounting, and they'll also use, you'll hear the term ERP, which is an enterprise resource planning tool. Companies use it. It would include payroll systems, financial systems, eventually human resource management systems, et cetera. For the Comptroller's office, my main concern is the payroll and the financial management systems. The systems that we currently have in our state are 30 plus years old. I think I heard our payroll system is 35.
People are shocked to hear that. I tell people they have 30-year-old computers they're operating the state on.
Yeah.
And I say, if you were talking to a group of people and said, raise your hand if you have a computer you're using that's over 10 years old, probably no one would raise their hand. And yet the state is doing billions of dollars with 30-year-old computers. One of the department heads a few years ago testified before the House that they can't find people to even write the code anymore because the system is so old.
That's the big problem. So it's all written in COBOL. And I only know a little bit about COBOL because when I was in grad school back in the early 80s, that was what we had to do our computer programs on. When you say the word COBOL, people go, oh my gosh, COBOL. I did that back in the 70s. I did that back in the 80s. No one knows how to program that now. So these people who are doing the work and fixing our system and updating it are on the verge of retirement. When they retire, there will be no one who can fix these systems anymore. So,
so it's really becoming critical.
There is a critical need to just be able to maintain our ability to get paychecks out and to roll up financials to get a new system in place. I think you've probably heard the state has over 800 different accounts. I couldn't believe that when I first heard it. Most states have somewhere 60 or less. So, and part of the problem is you start looking through the accounts, it's really hard to know where all that money is because there are so many different accounts you have to look through. So I asked the question, how come we can't have sub-accounts? Well, again, it's because the system we have is so old. Believe it or not, we cannot have sub-accounts. In my own bank account, I have sub-accounts, but we can't do it in the state. So it's difficult to roll up the numbers and see, here's a total that we're spending in this kind of category of expenses because those accounts are individually non-linked accounts.
Are you bringing people in, computer experts, whether from company A or I don't want to mention brands, to say, take a look at what we have, give us a proposal on what it would take to upgrade?
Yeah, so in the past year, before I even was on board here, there was a request for proposal done by the state requesting information for both a package software, a software system, and for companies to implement it. Those RFPs have been awarded. There are companies and programs that have been decided, waiting in the wings. What we need to do is get a contract signed and move ahead with it. Before we can do that, we have to figure out how to fund it. Before we can fund it, we have to get it through the legislature and help them understand it's important to do that. But if we are able to get that going, it will help us, A, consolidate the funds that we have, B, help us, it will really reduce our costs because right now, all the different agencies, everyone who reports into the state financials is on a different accounting system. All of those systems are old. All of those require money and a lot of time and effort.
Do they even talk to each other?
No. No, they do
I mean,
not.
how do you therefore take it from agency X and bring in those numbers and merge them?
So it all comes in individually. Some of the information comes in on paper. It has to be rekeyed. Some of the information is not compliant. They call it GAAP compliant with current accounting standards. Some of it is done on a cash basis, not accrual basis, which would be the accounting standard these days. All of that has to be adjusted. You can imagine that it's ripe for errors in all the transmission that has and translation that has to occur. It takes us almost 9 months, 8.5 months to get our financial report out after the end of the fiscal year, which it's really beyond
And by the time
usable.
you get it out, it's no longer, it was a snapshot in history.
It's not actionable. Right, it's not actionable. So all these reasons, I think, it'll be transparent. It will actually, most importantly, when we think about the cost of implementing something like this, will really help us reduce the ongoing cost of government, the efficiencies that it will bring, it will get the cost of maintaining all these separate systems out. There's just a lot, it will help us be more efficient and more effective with how we use our financial data. And so I think it's probably the best thing I can do as comptroller. There are estimates, hundreds of millions of dollars it will save our state once we can get this implemented. So,
I've often, this is an issue I was aware of from having done previous interviews, and you wonder, I think sometimes the state people don't want to spend money to upgrade because they think it'll look bad that they're spending money on themselves, and yet, would it not be true that even if we spent $200 million to upgrade the computer systems, you would get a payback on that in probably a relatively short amount of time?
Depending on what the savings estimates are, there's one saving estimate that is huge, which I don't want to mention because I haven't verified it yet, but it came from one of the consulting companies that was helping us on the front end of this. The payback is anywhere from 3 months to 8 months. So, I mean, it's under a year. It is really, there's no reason not to do it.
So you'd make over 100% a year return on
once
investment.
it's fully up and running. So there is a rollout period. It would probably take 3 to 5 years to get it fully implemented because we don't want to go out and just put it out there. You want to take it in small chunks and test it and make sure it's working before you roll it out further and before you bring on other pieces of the system. But it would be something just like cloud-based. You can update it. Just like your Windows automatically updates, or if you're on Microsoft or a Windows-based or a Mac-based system, you get those automatic updates. Our systems do not automatically update. So we would get to a point where we would not have an obsolete system constantly.
Let's talk a little bit. You talk about, I think you said something like, what was it, 800 different accounts, or how many?
800 to 900. 800 to 900, yes.
A lot of people are confused, and understandably so, when we talk about what the budget is for the state, because we often refer to just the general, the GRF, the general revenue funds, which is kind of the general operating part of the budget, but that's only about something like 55% of the budget. Then we have all these accounts that are designated accounts, whether it's the road fund or the this fund or the that fund, and money goes into there. One thing that's been done for years is these account sweeps, where they say, well, you're not using the money in those accounts. We're going to take it out. We're either going to take it out and repay it in time. I think now the proposal is that we're going to take it out and not repay it. We're just going to say you're not using it. Under that proposal, I've talked recently to a number of different people, some nonprofits like the Lahood program, some who are the people that dig up leaky gas tanks at gas stations and say, we need that money sitting there so that when we have a leaky gas tank, we can dig that up. So they say that is a false figure to look at that money sitting there and say it's not being utilized so we can take it. But what are your thoughts in general on this, the policy of fund sweeps and relative to the concerns as voiced by some of these others?
I think that we have used fund sweeps in the past in our government, and honestly, it's gotten us into some trouble doing that because we eventually owe that money back. And so the net effect has been to raise our spending in our state and put us more in debt. And that's actually between borrowing money and sweeping money from funds that we have to repay is part of the reason why we have an $8 billion debt right now that we need to pay. I say that with the full understanding that we have some critical needs to pay for now in this current year budget, because the budget that was passed by the legislature was not balanced when it had more spending in it than it had funding for it. And so now we're in this urgent need to address the issues for things like child care, as an example, where the funds have run out. I think whatever we do with sweeping of funds, and I know the governors and the legislature is looking for ways to use some of that money, we have to do it with a good, we have to address the urgent needs of our state, but we have to do it in a way that we maintain the long-term, the understanding of the long-term consequences of doing that, so that we do not add to our deficit. I think that some of the funds, that if we have to look at them individually on a case-by-case basis. I think that some of those funds, possibly by the time we would need to use them, that money could go back in. There are certain things like that are self-funding because of taxes on various services.
Well, the gas tank, as I mentioned, about 1.1 cent of every gallon that's pumped into a car would go towards the fund for replacing those gas tanks underground in storage.
Right. So I think we have to look at everything. I think borrowing with the intent to repay will be difficult, because we can't repay. We can't even pay the bills that we have now. And we need to get to a point where we're not borrowing money that we have to repay anymore. We're living within our means and working down our debt. If there are funds out there, case by case, where by the time we think we're going to need those funds, there will be enough additional funds put in there through the normal course of the taxes or whatever, the way the money flows into those funds, then I think it's up to the governor and the legislature to work through what amount of money they can take from those, still maintaining our ability to deliver the services that those we're set up to serve, to provide, but to help offset some of these budget issues this year.
I want to, before we run out of time, just to touch on a couple of those issues. To what extent, just in the way you view your job, and again, understandably, you're just kind of getting your feet on the ground and getting into it, but do you see yourself, from what we've talked about, as someone who's going to come in and say, look, I have management experience. This is just crazy the way this is, as we've already talked about, like the computer systems. And to what extent do you have to evolve into a political person to some extent? And I say to some extent because it seems like so much of the comptroller's job is almost more of a mechanical job. I mean, you collect, get the revenues into the accounts, you disperse them, you want to have good records. It's not so much, it doesn't seem to me, being a political position as much as one of a good manager. Is that, I'm wondering how you see that.
I agree with you on that. It is very much of I think a nonpartisan role in many respects. I mean, I come to this job trying to really bring good fiscal responsibility into this position. And my staff, you mentioned being a manager, my staff will say, I'm a roll up the sleeves, dig in, understand the problem, and try and make a difference person, which is actually why I'm really thrilled, honored, and feel so lucky that I landed in this position. I'm a problem solver. That's what I did in my career. We have problems that have to be solved in our state that are financial problems that I think my experience can be of help in, and not just in looking at financials, but looking at things like this new statewide accounting system and trying to be an idea leader to bring things like that forward. Another thing that people have talked a lot about is the consolidation of the fiscal offices in the state. Companies have one CFO, a lot of states have a CFO. We have two separate fiscal offices. There's some savings as a result of combining that. It's been out there for a long time. It would be a nice structural change to our government to just reduce another layer in cost.
And that was going to be a question. So you're in favor of merger of the two offices?
I am in favor of merger.
Which office would go away?
I think what you do is you would merge the functions into probably a new office, and just for the lack of a better term, a chief financial officer office. Just like you would have in a company, under which there would be a treasury function and a controller function, just like companies have. But you would reduce it to one constitutional officer. You would combine and be able to share resources and systems and reduce the number of extraneous offices. So I think it's an efficiency move, and it's something that businesses in other states have done. So I know why we originally split it, or what the state split it into two, with controls and a lot of things that are available today that weren't available back in 1970. I believe that we could do it efficiently. It saves.
And part of perhaps upgrading your computer system might even be more of a place to have cost containment and
then you have
checks.
revenues coming in. It's all coming into the same area. A financial office. So I'd like to see us do that. That's something else I'm working on. That idea's been out there a long time as well. It's not as big of a savings as getting a new accounting system would be. So that really, the accounting system is my first focus. But it saves. I think the estimates are something like $12 million. $12 million is a lot of money to me, and I think if we can save $12 million here, and we can save $1 million there, and $500,000 there, those are the kind of savings we have to start nipping and grabbing so that we can get out of the $8 billion debt that we have.
One of the few areas where there is controversial, interesting in your brief career thus far was this, when Governor Rauner had the executive order relative to union fees, and then you said, no, I'm not going to hold those back. Can you walk us through that issue, and to what extent were you consulted before he had that or not, and just bring us behind the scenes on how all this all came to pass?
So we were not consulted by the governor's office. He put out the executive order, and I felt first and foremost that I am put here to support all the people in Illinois. Most importantly, I have to follow the law. And within the statute of the responsibilities that I have as comptroller, I cannot, and actually I think this is a good thing, I cannot go set up a separate account or move money from one account into another account without being directed to do so by the legislature or by a court. There's no precedent for me to have done that anywhere in the comptroller's history. And as I think forward, the reason I said I think it's a good thing is because I don't think we want the comptroller's office to be able to say, I think I'd like to have a fund and move this money over here without it being somehow coordinated. It's a good check and balance that I cannot do that. So when the governor asked me to help execute through that executive order, it would have required me to set up a separate fund and to move those fair share dollars into a fund, and I could do neither legally. So we told the governor's office we can't do that, and they, I believe, have found a way to do that internally within their own set of agencies.
Time's growing short, but if the offices aren't merged, I don't know where we are there, would you run for the office next time? Or do you have an intention to do that if that were still, the office was still existed as now?
So I will be running for re-election in 2016. This should be a 4-year appointment, but the legislature and the governor passed a law saying this is going to be a special election. With respect to the merging of offices, the first thing we have to do is actually get that on the ballot as a constitutional amendment to merge the offices. So if I'm successful in doing that, that would be an amendment in 2016 to be merged in 2018. So that's 4 years down the road. I can't even think about that. I've got $8 billion of bills right now. I have to worry about finding out a way to pay.
You might have second thoughts by that time.
But right now, I have a lot on my plate, and I'm just going to focus on doing the best job I can do in my office by trying to lead common sense fiscal reforms, fiscal responsibility, things that will help us be more efficient and more effective in running our state. And I'm going to let everything else sort itself out. And I think if I do a good job, hopefully the people of Illinois will know that and want to support me in 2016.
All right. Well, Comptroller Leslie Munger, we appreciate you taking time to speak with us.
Thank you. Thanks very
good
much
luck
for
in your
talking with
position.
me.
You're watching the Illinois Channel, an independent nonprofit corporation formed to provide gavel-to-gavel coverage of Illinois state government and other public affairs events taking place across Illinois.
Next, from Springfield, we talked to State Representative Ron Sandack about legislation he's filed that would allow municipalities to seek bankruptcy protection under Chapter 9 of the U.S. Bankruptcy Code. This runs about 10 minutes.
Ron Sandack, thanks for joining us again on the Illinois Channel. I'm going to remind our viewers that you were formerly the mayor of Downers Grove. You have a piece of legislation concerning municipal bankruptcy. Why are you looking into that issue legislatively?
What's my motivation?
Yeah.
Well, the world is as it is. We're living in very lean times. And every unit of government, in my estimation, ought to be given every tool in the toolbox to avail itself every opportunity to take care of itself and fend for itself. I think what we learned in the governor's State of the State and budget address is that pretty lean times are ahead for the state of the state and for its municipalities. Currently, Chapter 9, Article 9 of the Bankruptcy Code provides relief, not liquidation relief, but reorganization relief for municipalities. It does require a state to authorize a filing or that a filing be permitted before they can avail themselves of that. My bill, it's House Bill 298, is very simple. It just authorizes municipalities to avail themselves of Chapter 9 if they otherwise qualify.
Now, we have famously, the Supreme Court just heard this argument on pensions and whether they can be cut, and the Constitution says they can't be cut or diminished, but that constitutional provision, if I'm correct, only applies to state employees, does it not? Not municipal employees.
That's right. Though the same rules are going to be in play with municipal pensions if they're tested. But of course, I mean, how that ties into my bill is really not a function of anyone having their pensions eliminated or diminished. The instructive case of Detroit actually adds credence to this. Many people don't know. Every pensioner in the Detroit system will be paid. Their COLA can be reduced from 3% to 2%, but their entire principal benefits and all go-forward payments with the reduction of 1 percentage point on the growth of those pensions pretty much remains the same. So what happened in Detroit was a restructuring. The corporate entity basically got more time to work with their creditors, restructure some, push out payments on others, work with the unions and in the collective bargaining realm, and they came to an agreement. It's just a structured, organized mechanism with the creditors committee and, of course, the trustees and a judge in order to determine what's in the best interest of taxpayers to that municipality. I think our taxpayers throughout Illinois ought to have those same availabilities.
Yeah, because you look at certain pension plans at different cities, and I would say
They
famously Chicago, not all of them are bad, but some are disastrous. And if a city, let's say like a Chicago, could declare bankruptcy, then in effect it would break the legal obligation to the pensions, but there would be, as you said with Detroit, you would start over and restructure. But it's not to say you would necessarily start from zero or that you wouldn't pay them anything, but it would
hardly
restructure the deal.
I mean, I think it's important for people to understand the context. Chapter 9 or Article 9 is something only a municipality can afford themselves of. Only a municipality can present a plan to the bankruptcy court to readjust their obligations. That has implications for municipal bondholders. It has implications for pensioners, and of course for the ongoing services the city provides. In that instance, city may determine they don't want to provide a certain service any longer going forward. They may provide for a different vendor for certain services. They then also have some leverage to negotiate with their public pensions and their public unions to determine their go forward. I look at it as a last chance. No mayor wants to take their city into bankruptcy. That's hardly a badge of honor. Instead, it's a measure of last resort. And you only do that if basically everything becomes unhinged and no one's acting in a reasonable manner. But you need that final place where we have a unbiased third party, which is a judge and a bankruptcy trustee, to say, okay, here's what we're going to do, and it provides a forum for adjudication and restructuring. 24 states, Terry, have this. 24. Since 1937, I think there's been 600 municipal bankruptcies of varying degrees. Vallejo, California, Stockton, California, San Bernardino, California, and lastly, Detroit, Michigan.
And the capital of Pennsylvania, Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, also declared bankruptcy.
And what's interesting, the state of Pennsylvania, if you remember back to the 90s, there were a bunch of towns in Pennsylvania that were on the brink, and they put an in-between step, and actually my bill talks about that too. It's a required non-binding, mediation prior to filing. In many of the, Harrisburg being an exception, but many towns in Pennsylvania went right to the brink because they were old steel mill towns, and they needed to recalibrate, Pittsburgh being most conspicuous, and kind of realign to the new world economy.
as a mayor, one of the complaints that all mayors that I've talked to have is that the legislature would be telling the cities to pay more to fire or police on their pensions. And it was the unfunded mandates. How much of a problem is that still going on, or has the legislature, in your estimation, understood the message?
Well, this legislator has understood that message for a while. And I regularly remind my colleagues that when we pass new laws that are new mandates that go unfunded, all we're doing is sticking our local units of government with another requirement that costs money. And all it is a best suggestion, kind of a big brother, you do this, and we're not providing resources. So, of course, we have to get out of that business. And, you know, anecdotally, Terry, unfunded mandates, many people have focused on the unfunded as the evil word in that term. I don't disagree. But we ought to pay more attention just to the term mandate, because not all great thinking is centralized in Springfield. Towns can determine for themselves their course of conduct. So can school boards. Parents, voters, local control, and voter empowerment really is felt most profoundly at the local level. So I think we could do a lot to help our municipalities out by getting off their back, staying out of their way, and giving them all the tools to fend for themselves.
And then the last question, on your bill, you're going to be having a committee hearing coming up. If it were to be enacted into law, what would be the effective date?
It would be effective, upon the governor's signature, and it would only be a prospective opportunity. Friday's hearing is really meant as a true subject matter educational forum. There will be bankruptcy lawyers that have practiced in other states on Chapter 9 proceedings. There will be investment banker that will talk about some of the municipal bond holder issues and probably dispel some issues that popped in a famous media release around here that likes to scream and yell about how horrific things can be, and dispel some old wives' tales. There are easy ways so that a bankruptcy being afforded to municipalities can be a win-win and really fortify taxpayers and citizens.
All right, Ron Sandack, thank you.
Thank you, Terry.
Next from Springfield, we talked to State Senator Darin Lahood, who in light of U.S. Representative Aaron Schock's recent resignation, discusses his interest in running for the seat. This runs about 5 minutes.
Senator Darin Lahood, as we stand here on March 18th, what a 24-hour period we have had with the resignation of Congressman Aaron Schock. He is in your district, a district your father, Ray Lahood, represented for many years, and as we understand it, just this morning you announced, now that Congressman Schock has announced his resignation, that you would be interested in seeking the office. Can you give us your impression of what's transpired over the last 24 hours and how you came to this decision?
Yeah. Well, I think it's yesterday's decision by Congressman Schock. I think it stunned all of us. I have a lot of sympathy for him. No one likes to see a public career end like that. And so I think there's a lot of sadness in the 18th Congressional District. And obviously he did what was best for his constituents, for his future, and I respect him for that. There is a vacancy now, and under the law, the governor will set a special election within 115 days, and I announced this morning that I'm a candidate for the Congressional District. About half of my Senate district is in the Congressional District. That's where I live, and let me just say, I prayed about it. I talked to my wife and family about it yesterday and made the decision today to run, and I've gotten a lot of encouragement throughout the district from constituents and supporters and fundraisers and business people and everyday people. And so I'm excited for the opportunity, but I take nothing for granted. I'm going to have to work very, very hard.
As I noted in the introduction, your father, Ray Lahood, had held the district for a number of years, and prior to that, your dad had been chief of staff to Bob Michaels, who had held it for 40 years or something like that? In fact, how long has it been in Republican hands now?
I don't know the answer to that, but I know Congressman Michael was there for 38 years in that position, and so it's been a strong Republican district. And as you know, all or parts of that district were in Abraham Lincoln's original congressional district.
This is interesting because any number of times we interview people running for office, but never that I recall where something just like falls into your lap, so to speak, or the opportunity comes out of the blue. So you went from not thinking at all about running for Congress to all of a sudden running for Congress. What do you tell us the thought process? So how did you come to the conclusion that, I should go ahead and do it?
Well, again, lots of thought and conversation with my wife about that, first and foremost. And then looking at the district. It's a large district, 19 counties. It's an area that I'm familiar with. In my Senate district, like I said, covers a lot of that. And it's very consistent with my district. Agriculture is the #1 industry there. Caterpillar is there. Manufacturing, and it's a district that I feel like I know the issues in. I spent some time as a prosecutor in the Tazewell County State's Attorney's Office. And so I'm very familiar with the district. I think I can reflect the values of the district. And, I'm going to take that to the voters and see what happens in the election.
I know you haven't even had probably any chance to, have you formed any kind of a legal committee to where you can even begin to raise money yet?
Today we formed a federal election campaign committee. We're doing that, and we're going to make sure and follow all the rules and compliance laws that are in place to do that. But we're off and running. I've talked to, I think, 18 of the 19 county chairmen. I've talked to many elected officials in the district, getting their support. And we've been getting strong support for our candidacy for this, and looking forward to it.
Won't keep you much longer, but as we said it many times here, your dad was the congressman for years, so intellectually you understand the whole process. You've been around it for years. Had you ever thought that maybe someday I would lead the legislature? Or had you not given it much thought?
You know what? I'm a big believer. You work hard at the job you have, and opportunities present themselves. And I've been very fortunate to be in my 5th year in the state Senate in a very good district. I love my job. I'm honored to be there. I've tried to work hard in that. I've been reelected once in that position, and opportunities like this don't come around very often. And so you got to take advantage of it, and that's what I'm attempting to do here. But it'll take a lot of hard work and discipline. You got to reflect the values here, and you got to convince people you're the right person for the job, and I hope to do that.
Senator, thank you, and
Thanks.
maybe we'll talk to you later when your campaign is underway.
Thank you.
You're watching the Illinois Channel, an independent nonprofit corporation formed to provide gavel-to-gavel coverage of Illinois state government and other public affairs events taking place across Illinois.
Next from Springfield, we attend a hearing of the House Education Funding Task Force and hear from representatives of the task force and a representative of Northern Illinois University discuss the effects of the Education Funding Reform Bill, SB 1. This runs about 35 minutes.
So here we are in our education funding task force, and I think we will start with the focus on Senator Menard's this year's Senate Bill 1, a bill that passed the Senate last year, did not come to a vote in the House. I know there have been some changes in the bill, and I think we're going to ask Jonathan Ford to start the discussion with that in mind. We're also going to ask Diane Rutledge to come and talk about Vision 2020. The focus of the group should be how, if at all, we should change the way we fund public education. I think the twin goals are equity and adequacy. How do we do a good job for all of our kids? But how in particular do we make sure that the children who come from areas that are not wealthy, not able perhaps to foot an adequate bill, what's our responsibility to help them? And I think Senate Bill 1 offers a pretty good start, but that should not be the only focus of our discussions. So I'm going to ask Representative Pritchard, who is the minority spokesman, if he'd like to say a few words before we turn things over to you.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. On your previous note about retirement, I didn't think anything was pending. I thought you had lots of objectives and vim and vigor yet to go, so we're not looking forward to that day. But to this issue at hand, it's certainly one that has had a lot of discussion. If you go back in our history all the way to 1818, we struggled with the way that we fund education in an adequate and equitable way. And we're still trying to achieve that goal. Clearly, where we are today does not achieve that goal. And I was somewhat disappointed that when the Senate task force convened, the House did not appoint any members to that. So I'm glad to see that the Speaker has decided it's appropriate that the House engage in a dialogue and look at what has been given in testimony, what we have learned from various school districts on the impact of SB 16, and soon to find what will happen with SB 1, so that we can move closer to that issue of adequacy and equity. I look forward to working with you and hearing lots more testimony. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ford.
Madam Chairman, members of the committee, I'm John Furr with Northern Illinois University. I provided technical assistance to Senator Menard on the drafting of Senate Bill 16 and now Senate Bill 1. My goal for the discussion, I know you have a PowerPoint that's been handed out that describes the bill, is to provide you the information on the major components of Senate Bill 1, to also provide a comparison to the current state funding formula, and to explain some of the key differences between Senate Bill 16 from last year and Senate Bill 1 this year. But just in terms of background, so you all understand the process that led to Senate Bill 16 and Senate Bill 1. In July 2013, that's when the Senate voted to create the Education Funding Advisory Committee with the understanding that it was time to review how public education funds are spent in our state. There were seven meetings of that committee from its designation through the report that was issued in early 2014. The committee's deliberation and the members who came before it and their materials are all posted on ISB's website if you'd like to review those in more detail. In February 2014, it's when the committee released its recommendations for a new state education funding system. Those were recommendations. There were some details associated with those, but there was certainly more work to develop those into an actual bill. So that was the work that happened between February when the report was issued and April 1st, 2014, was taking those recommendations, drafting those in bill form, having that released, and certainly wanting to make sure that there was significant time while the session still occurred for others to review and comment on Senate Bill 16 as filed. There were various changes to the bill that reflected that, and then the bill was passed in May 2014. But just in terms of what Senate Bill 16 and now Senate Bill 1, what it's trying to achieve on the next slide 3, is moving to an integrated primary state funding formula that's accounting for both student need and local resources. And so one major concept is to simplify our current system, which includes some funding going out the GSA formula, others through the supplemental poverty grant, a number of other grants through categorical, through the Chicago Block Grant, simplifying that into an overall integrated formula that would account for approximately 90% of funds that go from the state to local school districts, with some funds that remain in categorical funds, which I'll explain in more detail which ones are excluded from that formula. And also providing then the funding to local districts that still establishes a base foundation level that's intended to meet the needs of all students, but with a weight above that for specific district needs. And the idea is that from a local district perspective, that the amount that would account for that weight for their local needs would establish the overall level of spend. There would be some expectations for state funding for that and local resources, with really state funding targeted to close the gap in what's needed with those local resources to achieve that overall weighted level. But also the concept that districts can continue to spend above that. So if districts choose to be able to raise local taxes to spend above and beyond what that weighted need is, they have the absolute ability to do that, and that's not changed by this bill. One of the other ways to look at that on slide 4, just to look at local need again, this concept that you start with a base amount that accounts for all students' characteristics, you begin to provide an additional weight above that for student need, and then in terms of how state and district funding is allocated to address that need, it's really dependent on local resources. So when you look at slide 4, the district on the far right would be one where for certain student needs that might have previously been accounted for through categorical funds that didn't take account for local property wealth, that district would be expected to account for some of that need with its own resources. So that's one of the major changes with the Senate Bill 16 and Senate Bill 1 funding structure, is having that expectation that local resources begin to address those needs. So for those who might prefer a more formulaic approach, on slide 5, this really lays out the distinction between our current general state aid formula and the proposed primary state aid formula that's in Senate Bill 1. So the current formula provides for general state aid with the overall foundation level, subtracting out available local resources per pupil and then multiplying that number by the average daily attendance for the school district. And there's certain funding parameters for the alternate formula, and also a flat grant for all districts if the local wealth is at 175% of the foundation level. So the major change with the primary state aid formula is within the calculation of primary state aid having a weighted foundation level. So rather than using the base foundation level, there's a weighted foundation level where you still subtract out the available local resources and then multiply that by the average daily attendance. There's still the concept of a flat grant, which is incorporated more based on a percentage of the foundation level rather than a fixed dollar amount, but that concept still applies. And then when you go to slide 6, that describes how that weighted foundation level is calculated. So that's taking the foundation level times a district weighted average. And that district weighted average is going to range depending on the specific student needs within that district, from just above 1.0 to up to 1.9 or so, depending on the needs within that particular district. And that's calculated by taking that 1.0 number times additional weights on a cumulative basis based on particular student characteristics. One of the changes that was made in Senate Bill 1 from Senate Bill 16 is to add a regionalization factor, to begin to apply that to weights to account for the fact that costs within our states vary by regions. So that was some of the comments that we heard through the Senate Bill 16 process, that there needed to be an account for regionalization. So that is factored in using the National Center for Education Statistics data, which looks at wages outside of the education sector, which is really what drives the local costs for their teachers and for their workforce, are those wage amounts. To go through a little bit more of the math on slide 7 for the additional weights so you really understand how the numbers work. There are weighting factors for various categories of students. For English language learners, for example, the weighting factor is 0.0. So if you had a school district that had an ELL percentage of 30%, then the math to figure out how that would apply in the formula would be taking 0.20 times 0.3 equaling 0.06. That would be added to that 1.0 figure. So that's the basic math for determining the weighted formula for each district. And then you perform that math for each of the different student characteristics to determine what each district's weight is. So with Senate Bill 1, every school district in the state will have their own weighted amount based on their own student characteristics, with transparency around how that was determined and how funding is flowing out based upon those specific weights. Just to highlight some of the changes from Senate Bill 1 to Senate Bill 16 for the low income percentage, there's a weight that ranges from 0.25 to 0.75 depending on the low income concentration. And that's really because research shows that as low income percentages increase within a school district, there are additional costs and needs a school district has to address because of the concentration of poverty for those needs. So that's maintained. For how low income is counted, though, one of the changes that was proposed in Senate Bill 16 was to base that on the count of 185% of families that are at 185% of the federal poverty level, and that's the equivalent number that's used for free and reduced price lunch. What we found, though, in running the numbers of that is that that was not what ISB would call investment grade data that they had, because there have never been any sort of stakes that's been tied to that particular data. So there were a number of school districts that did not have accurate low-income counts as a result of the use of that number, as opposed to what's in the current state aid formula, which is based on families participating in various DHS programs. So what's proposed in Senate Bill 1 is maintaining the current way to count low income for several years, while there's an effort to ensure that there is better data that's tied to the free and reduced price lunch count of 185% to make sure the districts aren't penalized based on bad data there. One of the other changes which is made in Senate Bill 1 for special education, Senate Bill 16 had an assumed percentage for every district in the state of 13.8% based on the overall state average. That was really done to make sure that there wasn't incentives within the funding formula to have more students characterized for being identified for special education than was necessarily appropriate based on those needs. And there could be many districts that in fact can have strategies which are educationally sound to reduce their IEP count by working with students before they may be designated. But one of the things that we heard that there are districts throughout the state, though, that have legitimate reasons for having higher than average state percentages for special education, whether it's either associated with the low income concentration in their district or whether it's associated with the special education services that they might offer within that district. So one of the things that the bill now does is allow districts to work with the State Board of Education to verify a higher percentage than the state average and to have that be counted as part of their count for the state formula. Just to stay moving to the actually before I move to the next slide, there's a couple of other weights that I do want to address as well. We do have weighting that is tied to outcomes, which as far as I know, we're the only state that actually has done that within the funding formula. Specifically, there is weighting that's attributable to students that receive AP scores of 3 or higher or that receive dual credit. We also have weightings associated with students that are career pathway completers. So again, it's looking at how can we begin to have weightings within the funding formula that are addressing certain outcomes, which we know help to prepare more students for college and for careers. And as I said before, I believe that we're the only state that has those types of weights that are specifically incorporated within its overall funding formula. To move to a little bit more details on special education, this is one area where it's important to understand what's in the proposed formula and what's out of the proposed formula. So within the proposed formula, there are 3 existing line items that are fully incorporated. The children requiring special education services line item, which is generally based now on a census-based approach. It's not based on an actual student count with special education. There's personnel reimbursement line item, which again is currently based on the number of staff within a district that are providing special education services, and the summer school services line item. Those are incorporated within the new funding formula. But there are 2 important exclusions from the funding formula for special education transportation and for private placement for students that have particular special education needs that cannot be served by the school district and need to be placed outside the school district to meet those needs. So those would remain categorical line items separate from the formula, and that's really based on the fact that the particular needs that a district might have for special education or for high need placements don't lend themselves very well to formulaic treatment. So whether or not they have to provide transportation services to students will depend in part on the geography and the structure of the school district where they provide those services and those particular student needs. And certainly that's the case for private placements as well. So those were 2 areas where it was, in structuring the formula, the proposal was to keep those excluded and basically keep those line items as they're currently structured. There are, within Senate Bill 16, there are various hold harmless provisions and phase-in provisions which are included in the bill to make sure that we're addressing the impact of this shift within the formula. One of the adjustments, and these are detailed on slide 9, is the PTEL adjustment, which is currently within the general state aid formula. And I'll talk through the general overview of the PTEL adjustment, but I know that we have experts here at the State Board that can get into much more detail about that as needed. But generally what the PTEL adjustment does within the general state aid formula is currently accounts for the fact that tax cap districts cannot avail themselves of all their local resources that would otherwise be included within the formula. Because we talked about before that available local resources is a key driver of the funding that school districts receive. So for tax cap districts, what the formula does now is currently substitute in a PTEL EAV, which accounts for the fact that they are tax capped, sort of substitutes a fake lower EAV that is intended to be more equivalent of the actual amount of their local resources that they can tap into. So that's a current adjustment that we have in state law. So that adjustment remains with Senate Bill 1 as proposed. One important change, though, that's done is to add a PTEL EAV floor. And that ensures that the EAV that's used for PTEL adjustments never falls below 85% of a school district's actual EAV. Because remember, the lower EAV, the lower local resources you have, the more money you get out of the formula. So this begins to make sure that there is a closer connection to to the actual EAV when that PTIL adjustment is made, which will help to control costs going forward with that PTIL adjustment amount. There have been criticisms about the transparency, about the amount of the formula that's being attributable to PTIL adjustments, and Senate Bill 1 ensures that those are clearly reported out to provide transparency about what's being used for that adjustment and what's being used for other formula payments. There is a new concept within Senate Bill 1 for a hold harmless adequacy grant, and that is addressing the fact that there were various districts throughout the state that were relatively low spend, but also relatively high tax, that for various reasons were losing funding under the change within this bill. So the adequacy grant is targeting funding through a hold harmless approach for those districts where, in comparison, based on their operating expense per pupil to other districts, are fairly low spenders, but also have an operating tax rate that's higher than the statewide weighted average. And as some of the preliminary analysis begins to show that many of the outliers that were talked about for the Senate Bill 16 process would be addressed as part of this adequacy grant process and some of the other changes within the bill. The loss cap that was in Senate Bill 16 continues on with Senate Bill 1 at $1,000 per pupil loss cap, although at the recommendation of the State Board of Ed, not having that in perpetuity, but having there be an eventual sunset for that loss cap. Obviously, if more funds are put into the formula over time, then that would not be an issue for those districts. And finally, there's a phase-in approach for having decreases and increases from the base year phased in over 3 fiscal years. So if you are a quote-unquote winner with Senate Bill 1, those amounts would be phased in, and the same with those who would be losing funds. The last area that I want to touch on quickly is for oversight and accountability. There are a number of provisions in Senate Bill 1 that ensure that there is necessary support for various student populations and transparency around how funds are spent. There is specific funding which is provided for ISB for staff and contractual services related to support for ELL and special education students. For all school districts, there will be complete transparency about what their weights are, how those are attributable to different student populations, and the amount of funding, both at the state and the local level, that is exactly attributable to those student populations. For English language learner students, there was some concerns in Senate Bill 16 that some of the current accountability processes for budgeting around ELL populations was lost. So that's been reinstated to make sure that there is transparency about how student supports are being provided for those students. And then also for certain districts that aren't making academic progress benchmarks, ensuring that their budgeting for student populations will relate to student needs within those areas. One of the last areas that I'll touch on for school-based budgeting is one important shift within the bill as well, within the second year, moving to a system where ISB can begin to work with districts to account for revenues and expenditures at the individual school level, because we find that throughout our state, some of the within district disparities are as great as some of the disparities that we have across districts. So I know that was significant information that I provided on the mechanics of the bill. I'm happy to answer questions and know that you'll be receiving some other perspectives as well.
Thank you very much. Questions for Mr. Furr? Nobody with a question? Nobody? I have a quick question, and that is when you first introduced Senate Bill 16, it then was, the way special education operated was quite different from the way it's described today and different from the way the bill finally was when it passed the Senate. That is to say, I thought you had private tuition residential as part of the larger formula, yes, rather than splitting it out.
Yes. Madam Chairman, so when the bill was initially introduced, there was a separate issue that was included within the bill as filed, trying to address a current discrepancy in state law and how districts are reimbursed for high-cost students depending on whether or not they're served in district or out of school district. So currently, if a school district is choosing to place a student outside the school district who is a high-needs special education student, they're basically reimbursed once they're above 2 times their per capita amount for expenditures for that student. And for within district, it's at 4 times, so they're actually incentivized to do out-of-district placements. And so as filed, there was discussion about trying to equalize that treatment of in-district and out-of-district. There was significant discussion and concerns, given that the funding was still suggested to be outside of the primary state aid formula. It's really a somewhat separate issue as it remains a categorical spend, but was an issue that I believe on the Senate side they decided was not right for action.
Representative Bradley.
I'm of the belief, as downstate Southern Illinois, only Southern Illinois, deep Southern Illinois representative on this panel, I'm of the opinion that a child in Marion and the value of their education is worth as much as anywhere else in the state. That's not the case under the system we have currently. My children are not given the same value of education as children in the other parts of the state. And so my question to you is, and as we move forward in this process, is does your proposal fix that?
Yes. Well, that I think with this proposal, it certainly begins to address the fact that we have limited state dollars to spend on how children are educated throughout the state. So it's about 25% of the money that's spent on children within our state comes from the state. So the rest, 65%, is based on local resources, 10% federal. So what Senate Bill 1 does is really targets that spending to where it's needed the most, to those districts that do not have the local resources to provide the education needed based on their individual student populations. So yes, we do move to a system that looks at student characteristics, funds based on that need, and also truly accounts for the local district ability to pay.
But it's not equalized.
In terms of there is the regionalization factor, but
it's not equalized. It may be a step in that direction, but it's not equalized, right?
Well, it's a step toward that direction, but I think that there will always, there will certainly still be discrepancies.
You'll do better in here just answering questions directly.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Representative Ives.
Thank you. Does Senate Bill 1 actually set out the foundation level like Senate Bill 16 did?
Yes, the foundation level is treated the same so that it would...
Do you put a number to it? Because in Senate Bill 16, they had a number that was lower than the 6119 level.
So the Senate Bill 16 had 6119 in the bill. However, that would be reduced based on the amount of appropriation. And so the reason for doing that now, we have a foundation level number in law, but if the appropriation is lower than what's needed to fund that, proration occurs.
Right.
So when that happens outside the formula, that begins to have very different impacts for districts depending on the amount of state funding they're
Now,
receiving.
I specifically remember that the foundation level in Senate Bill 16 was significantly, like 5,200 is what they started with.
Well, that was based on, because the foundation level is lower based on the actual that assumed a lower appropriation, that assumed current appropriation levels, and that was the adjustment down.
Okay. Also, did you, in terms of defining what are available local resources, does it also include that Chicago gets to subtract out its pension payments?
It does.
That's still in there?
Yes.
That they get to subtract out their pension payments as part of their available local resources?
Right, as the one district that's making that payment on behalf of its teachers.
Well,
right,
what about other districts that make they make a pension payment too? They make 0.58%, or they're supposed to.
Well, in terms of the specific amount that's attributable to Chicago for being subtracted, that is a payment that only Chicago
Chicago gets it, and no other district gets it, even if they make a pension payment.
Like I said, in terms of the dollar amount that's attributable for Chicago's resources, that is only in law the responsibility of Chicago for making that payment. For other districts, that payment is made on their behalf by the state.
That's going to be a problem. Thank you.
Representative Tryon.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. After I run everything through my decoder ring, we're still not sure what our questions are, but the tax cap and a PTEL adjustment, provides the formula some difficult time adjusting everybody, I think, equally. For instance, the PTEL was designed to protect a property taxpayer in a time period where the EAV was exceeding the CPI. I don't think the framers of the tax cap ever anticipated a time where the EAV would be declining and the CPI would be going up. And that's the situation we found ourselves in, primarily in the suburbs since '08. In certain areas in the suburbs have taken drastic devaluation of real estate. has driven the tax rates in some cases up drastically, so that you now have, I've given my house as an example, I'm living in about a $220,000 house as it's assessed. I'm paying over $7,000 in property taxes, and 68% of that's going to the school district. So my rate's being driven up, and then we're in Representative Bradley or downstate districts where they actually are at their statutory caps, with tax rates. Then we might have another district that might be, and I can use Chicago as an example. I think last year their tax rate was $2.58, $2.60. And that, I mean, how is that factored in? I mean, there's a tax burden applied to the real estate taxes locally that I'm not sure is being reflected in the state aid adjustment based on the taxpayer's ability to pay.
Right. Well, that in terms of the treatment of the PTEL, either uses the PTEL EAV is determined in the formula, which accounts for that ratio increase, or the actual EAV, whichever is lower. So if a community's the local property wealth would fall below whatever that assumed adjustment is under PTEL, you would be using the actual information as part of this adjustment. So they would be getting more funding if they were actually losing dollars below the PTEL.
That would happen if you had rapid inflation and you couldn't get all the dollars, right? I'm talking about we've been experiencing rapid deflation,
right?
And the tax rates are going up, and the burden felt by each taxpayer is way different in the state. That's why in the suburbs, when we start talking about the former Senate Bill 1, it was very our Senate Bill 16. It was just a showstopper. I mean, you couldn't place any more property tax burden on the property taxes in the suburbs because, the rates now are $5, $6, $7 per $100 of assessed value in comparison to many districts where the rates were substantially less. In fact, I could use Danville as an example. In the year 2000, they got $2,600 a child. Under the current formula, they're getting about $7,600 a child. So the formula actually did its job. It provided more resource to that school district. I have a school district that's District 158. They're only spending $8,800 per child. And here's a school district getting almost 100% of what my school district is. They're actually spending more to educate a child there than I'm spending here, but my tax burden is way up here. And that's going to be the problem and the conflict we have if we're just going to talk about equity funding. So I mean, and somehow we have to get our arms around that. Either there has to be more than a hold harmless. There has to be some evaluation of the tax burden and how much that should be too.
Right, and I think there was the acknowledgement with Senate Bill 16, Senate Bill 1, that there's a limit to what can be achieved through school funding formula changes and other issues that do have to be tackled through the tax code. And so there are structures that are in place for kind of ongoing review of the PTEL adjustments and making recommendations, but also understanding that some of those issues truly will need to be addressed through tax code processes, which we didn't try to tackle through this particular bill.
There are some school districts that have high EAVs and low rates, and get lots of state aid. I guess that's my point. And somehow we got to get our arms around that. And we're all going to have different issues in our districts. And we have, I think, a big problem, and we need to work on it. And I would like to also think that we'll have a conversation about, best practices and adequacy. And I would say 50 years ago, an education in my school district and an education in Representative Bradley's district looked a lot similar than it does today. And we have technology that's way different. We have school districts that aren't able to offer chemistry, things like that. So, I think adequacy and tax burden are two things that have to also, I think, be a part of judging how much money goes someplace.
Yeah.
Representative Pritchard.
Thank you, Madam Chair. In all of the discussion that's gone into SB 16 and SB 1, has there ever been much discussion about changing the reliance on funding education through the property tax?
That I think with this proposal and the recommendations that came back from the EFAC committee, that from what came through that committee, there was always the intention to make sure that there would be an accounting for local resources as part of that, and knowing that in terms of making, again, a shift to where a percentage substantially larger than 25% of local education spend, and to have much more of that to come from the state would require much more massive structural changes than are even proposed through this bill. So, in terms of my specific role really came in around the drafting bill stage. I'm not sure what all the alternatives were that came into the EFAC recommendation, but at least what came out of that committee wanted to keep some of the same fundamental concepts around how you account for available local resources, but just accounting more for that in more funding categories and adding the student weighting components.
Well, I mean, I certainly see the need to look at the needs of a district to educate students and the challenges those students bring. But all of this seems to be predicated upon the property tax, which Representative Bradley mentioned just is a real issue when you get downstate and property values have really diminished. So the only way you're going to get at some degree of adequacy is looking at other forms of funding to bring the revenue that's necessary to educate the students where they are today. So I just wanted to see if there had been any real discussion on that issue in all of the debate that's gone on in the Senate so far. Thank you.
I think the answer is no. The parameter was stick with the current ratio of funding between property taxes and state funding, and then see what you can do about equity. So right. I think that's an important discussion to have, Representative. I wish we would, but I think that was not part of the discussion about Senate Bill 1601. Representative Fortner.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I apologize if this came up. We had to go to committee for 10 minutes, so I apologize getting up in the middle of your presentation as well. One of the things I observed as the impact in Senate Bill 16 is that there were some thresholds that created some unusual effects. And in particular, there was an effect where a district where 3/4 of the students in the high school district, a dual district, 3/4 of the students in the high school district were served by one middle school. The way the formula worked out, you could have an 8th grader from that middle school, which had a significantly large low-income population, where the formula actually gave them a huge boost of thousands of dollars per pupil under SB 16. They would walk 3 blocks to the high school, and the state support would drop to $165. Merely because another 25% of the population came from other areas. And it appeared to be just because of arbitrary thresholds, and I wonder if that has been corrected in SB 1.
Well, one of the major issues that I had talked about was how the low-income percentage was being counted. And so we were proposing a shift in Senate Bill 16 from a current count based on DHS programs to a count based on the same number used for free and reduced price lunches. Now, free and reduced price lunch data at the high school level is notoriously inaccurate for various reasons, because high school kids don't sign up, their parents don't get involved. And so there were many districts who were seeing a significant loss in funding because of that bad data issue. So that is an issue that we have fixed by maintaining the DHS percentage going forward, and at least with some of the anomalies that were part of Senate Bill 16, particularly for those high school districts and the others, kind of the preliminary review of what the impact would be for Senate Bill 1, those were addressed.
So what you're saying is that this fix would make it so that they would use the K-8 numbers and project them forward to the high school, or how does that work then?
They would continue to use the same numbers that are being used for the poverty grant, which is based on the percentage of families within their boundaries that are participating in DHS programs.
Okay, so it's based now, and would that apply to both K-8 districts as well as 9 to 12s?
Yes.
Okay, so none of them would be based on the free reduced lunch?
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions? I just have one quick one. I didn't quite understand the import of the question having to do with who's making pension payments, but my understanding, and I certainly could be dead wrong, is that the state doesn't require districts outside the city of Chicago to contribute to the teacher pensions.
Correct.
But Chicago does
Is
pay
required,
for
correct.
not only the state pension, downstate teachers, but also we pay for our own. Some districts may decide to pick up employee contributions to the pension system, but they're not required by state law to do so.
Correct.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Furr.